I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Data minimization. It may be one of the most difficult tenets in data protection law today, and it is also one of the most prevalent. Whether it's HIPAA, the GDPR, the CCPA, or the many other state laws in the US that are popping up, each of them emphasize data minimization in different ways. What does it mean? Well, at bottom, it is a principle that an organization should only collect, use, disclose, or otherwise process the minimum amount of personal data necessary to accomplish the permitted purpose. So, for example, an e-commerce company selling a product to a consumer, the company may need name, address, email, credit card number, probably doesn't need social security numbers, date of birth, health information, and other sensitive data. While that example may seem easy, there are actually many other closer calls which make it difficult to determine whether data is necessary to be collected. And frankly, collecting more data up front is often easier than trying to fill gaps in the future. So that results in a natural incentive to collect more and more data. And what's certainly harder than data collection? Well, that's data destruction, which means that data often sits for long periods of time in a dormant state. As a result, data minimization, you can think of it really going hand in hand with data security, because reducing the amount of data inside of your organization not only facilitates compliance with a host of laws, it also could reduce the impact of a data security incident, because less data exposed means affected population will also be smaller. The cost of responding will be less, and the probability of regulator and plaintiff action lessened. It's also the case that data minimization is easier said than done. It's a relatively easy principle to articulate, but so difficult to implement. Because to do it effectively, organizations need to implement data governance programs that focus on the company's larger data-related strategy and operations. That's truly a big lift. To make sense of all of this, I've invited Matt McClelland from Ankura to the podcast. Matt leads the data minimization service line at Ankura and helps a number of companies establish the underlying infrastructure to support data minimization programs. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So, Matt, so happy that you're joining, kind of lending, your area of expertise in this space, which is quite complicated. Maybe I'm interested in just starting the conversation, learning a little bit more about how clients are approaching you to solve these issues, and importantly, kind of what challenges are they looking to solve as part of that engagement?
Yeah, so we get a lot of different engagements depending on where people are on their journey. Some folks are just starting off, especially if they're compared to privacy issues. CPRA, CCPA have really kickstarted a lot of things in the retail space. We also have organizations that come to us because they are looking at reducing their e-discovery risk, or they're looking to migrate or minimize their data from financial challenges. And so it really depends on the organization and where they are in their journey to data minimization.
I mean, I like the word journey here because I think it's super important to frame this data minimization as really a component of a much larger undertaking, which I think can go by a variety of names, but probably most often is referred to as a component of data governance or information governance. That itself is a very large project and often has multiple meanings to multiple people. Interested in your perspective, how do you see minimization as a component of governance, and what are the other kind of key components of that governance program that you're helping clients with?
So I would say minimization is one of the things that happens later in your journey. There are a lot of things foundationally that need to be in place, from policy, procedure, retention schedules, governance committees. All those sorts of things need to be built up before you really undertake minimization, because there's a compliance component to it that you want to stay away from spoliation. You want to make sure that you understand where your risk is in terms of the types of data you have, whether it's privacy risk, financial risk, specific PI or IP. And so those sorts of things are foundational, and minimization comes later on. And so the minimization is really a function of understanding where you're going to get the most benefit for reducing that footprint. You can have some security concerns, breach concerns as well. And that's where we see a lot of benefit, is understanding your environment, having those foundational components in place, and then taking your minimization to implementation across the organization.
So, I mean, perhaps then let's start maybe more in the beginning before we get into the minimization specific issues. If we're thinking that there is a number of action items that are needed before we start thinking about actually having to minimize data within inside of our environment, you mentioned data retention. Usually I think of minimization and retention and data classification as like, three sides of the same coin, maybe to use a poor analogy, but
Right.
it's all the three of those kind of work together. Interested in your perspective, is that how you think of it? Like, is you're starting to approach this problem, or do you think about it differently?
No, I think you're right. There's classification is key. How are you going to be able to make determinations about what retention you're going to put on your data and your content if you don't have it classified a certain way? And there's really kind of a continuum of automated to manual on how you're going to do that classification. And there's a lot of building of taxonomies. You've got your security classifications that are going to be, public, private, and so on. You've got classifications around the retention itself, like what kind of record or information type is it? And then there may be other classifications that you need to know from a privacy side, right? Is it PI information? If you're in the financial industry or you're in healthcare, there's different types of security classifications and privacy considerations to take under when you're doing that classification. So that's a big undertaking of itself. And the retention is just one piece of that, but it's a key piece to know when you're going to actually be able to do data minimization in compliance with the other facets of classification.
So maybe kind of thinking this in a broad way, you would say your retention policy is going to establish your kind of rules of the road. This is how long we are going to keep this type of data, this type of information, this type of document. Classification, right, is going to be whenever we get a new document, we ever get a new piece of data, whenever we get a new piece of information, making sure we're taking that information and tying it back to the rules that we had defined in the retention policy. And then minimization you can think of as almost adherence to the policy to make sure that you are complying with the retention periods that you have, and also not trying to collect more than what you had articulated that you were going to do.
Correct. And, you've got these warring factions now with the privacy laws that come into place. Historically, you could keep things as long as you wanted, as long as you didn't keep it less than the required retention from whatever citation in state and federal. But now with the privacy laws, there's a push to only keep things as long as necessary, as long as there's a business need. And so the keep everything forever approach and having very minimal negative impact, that's no longer the case. And so you've kind of got the rock in the hard place of data minimization. And to do that effectively, you got to know what you have. And that requires you to have a good, solid retention schedule that you can map to your different repositories, whether those are structured or unstructured or third party, and understanding what lives in those repositories and how long it needs to be kept. And that is fundamental to being able to do data minimization at scale, making it part of your business as usual, your BAU approaches. And to your point earlier, it is a journey. You're not going to be able to take out terabytes or petabytes or even exabytes of data in a short period of time. You're going to have to build that out, roadmap it, and have a plan to address the content that is most important to your organization in a measured and consistent approach.
So if I'm thinking of those three components, I mean, retention, just setting out the policies, setting out the timelines, that itself has a lot of nuance, a lot of kind of very complicated set of requirements. And, oftentimes I would see that clients come for help with the retention policies and retention strategies. And one of the difficulties is just trying to get a handle on both what data is being collected and then two, what are the requirements with respect to that data? Because oftentimes, while the new privacy laws talk about only keeping personal information for the minimum amount of information time needed, which has its roots in the GDPR and number of kind of the non-US oriented data protection laws, there are voluminous number of other laws in the United States that speak to mandatory requirements to retain records, and those requirements come in all different shapes or forms, whether they're financial data, whether they're kind of data that relates to employment, whether they're data related to compliance, and they can be at different levels of government. Could be federal requirements, could be state requirements, could be local requirements. In other words, you could have a law that says, for 1099 workers in Topeka, Kansas, you need to maintain the records for X period of time. Interested in your perspective, what you see, how organizations deal with that type of complexity when they define the rules of the road. And then let's figure out then after that, how is it that we start to align data coming in against those categories we set up?
Yeah, the jurisdictional requirements can be very complex. We take an approach that is not new. Like there's a big bucket approach to consolidating and grouping your information together. And where possible, we want to align to the most consistent retention period across your jurisdictions. And then if necessary, make call outs for things that are, we'll say, unique to that area. When we get to data minimization, the complexity that creates is that you need to be able to identify the location, the jurisdiction of that particular data. So you need to be able to know, is it in this location or another? There's laws from the EU to the US in terms of where data can be stored and, other countries as well. So that understanding of where data is managed and stored and maintained is critical. And so that really lies toward a data mapping, being able to take that retention schedule, because the laws are the laws, right? Being able to understand what the requirements are is only part of the battle. Once you understand what your requirements are, you then have to take those forward. And so there's a mapping requirement of saying that what data lives in what jurisdiction, what the requirements for retaining that information are, and then having a mechanism in place, whether that is native to the application, whether that's a tool you've bought to scan and identify and minimize data, or it's a combination where there's some manual processes in there. That data mapping is a key component to knowing what you're going to actually do after you've identified the laws and the jurisdictions.
So that makes sense. And so once we have those rules, how do you think about classification as new data is coming in, right? So Matt, if you're working at Ankura and I send you an email with client data, for an engagement that you and I are working on together, and, it includes XYZ data, how are you thinking about how to classify that particular email? And maybe not making it specific to Ankura, but like thinking about how clients deal with that, because they're going to get all sorts of data every day, moment by moment. And are you clicking and saying, okay, this data falls in this particular category, and then thus adding another workflow or another thing that individuals need to do? Or are you looking at automated solutions? Interested in how you're approaching that aspect.
So ideally, you would have at least some level of automation, if not complete automation for that. Ideally, again, we would like to not add things to people's plate, not new processes, not new ways of having to, because most folks are not hired as information governance or information management professionals. They have a day job, whatever that day job is. And so what we want to do is find ways to facilitate easy, clean identification of data. Sometimes that's automated, sometimes it's semi-automated, sometimes it is manual. And email is one of those difficult places that it's everything to everyone, right? It's everything from let's go get lunch to signage of contracts to managing your day-to-day business for whatever process it is. And so we typically don't start with email, in all honesty. We start with things that are more standard for the organization. And there are usually classification that already exists. It's just done without the support of technology or the consistency that is required. And so we help bring that consistency and help the organization identify things they're already doing, even though it may not be tagged or identified through a consistent taxonomy. So we'll help them build that taxonomy. We'll help them build out that approach to identifying the content, classifying it, and then put processes in place that make it cleaner for folks. It's usually again, another evolution to automation from identifying that content with folks and classifying it within the guardrails that we set up.
Okay, so if I'm thinking that I've built that foundation, right, that you mentioned is so important for minimization efforts, we have established kind of the rules of the road and established our data retention policy. We have a data classification mechanism so that we are going to be able to classify data in accordance with that retention policy. We have some sort of automated means by which we are doing that in the ordinary course. How do you then take those foundational elements and then start to implement them, especially on when we're trying to emphasize adherence to those minimization strategies and minimization requirements that are core to all of those emerging privacy laws that you mentioned?
Yeah, so we recommend a kind of three-pronged approach across structured, unstructured, and physical content. The way you manage that. There is a need with the structured to make sure that you do an impact analysis and a risk analysis because of the connectivity of structured systems. Removing data from one row in an application may have an impact downstream. And so you want to make sure you're really connected to your IT partners to understand how that is connected. And then treat that as any other software development lifecycle. You're essentially adding a retention or a deletion button, a minimization button. And so working through automating with the requirements using things like the retention schedule and taxonomies and other things to build those requirements for your structured is based on your risk ranking is the structured approach. From the unstructured, there's all kinds of different unstructured locations, right? From the old share drives to Teams to SharePoint, Box, whatever. There are a number of different solutions that allow you to scan the data, classify it either out of the box with some of their out of the box things like AI, machine learning, as well as add in your own criteria that allows you to tag and classify the data and then take action upon it based upon that classification. And then your physical content, the stuff that's in paper boxes, whether that's in file cabinet or out at an offsite storage location, there is a sampling approach to identifying that content and minimizing it. And there are really three facets of the overall data minimization, but they have to be handled differently because it's not a one size fits all.
And how are you thinking about this, or maybe are you thinking about it? Is there a distinction between legacy data versus kind of newly created data? Because
Sure.
I think in some ways, at least my experience is that it's so much easier to implement something like this go forward than it is to try to go back to historical data sets, which may be voluminous and may not have a lot of attention or frankly even expertise or historical knowledge as to their creation or importance.
For sure. There's definitely the go forward and the legacy remediation. And they're two distinct lanes of an overall program. The go forward, there are things to put in place to make sure that you're engaged as a program leader, information governance program leader, with any new technology, any business transformations, any mergers and acquisitions to understand what's happening so that you can put those guardrails in place on the go forward and make sure that the automation or business processes are put in place initially so that you don't have an issue whenever the retention is hit in 5, 6, 7, 10 years, whatever the retention period is. For remediation of legacy content, that's a whole other set of issues to deal with. And typically, we find that the most successful are those that look at remediation to their most risky content, the places that they have privacy information, the places that have their company's IP, the places that there's been breach attempts, either successful or unsuccessful in the past. Where have there been e-discovery issues? Remediating that data in terms of minimizing the footprint that you have is really the key. And being realistic about the fact that there are so many repositories, some valuable, some not, that it's unlikely you're going to go and remediate every single piece or every repository that you have. And so that's where the data mapping and having an information asset risk ranking for what's my riskiest or most valuable assets to allow you to build out that roadmap for remediation, and being okay with and communicating to leadership that we're likely not going to go after everything, whether it's 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, because things change. There's low value in some of this stuff. It's just not worth our effort unless it's a large volume of content that's going to save you money on the technology side, whether it's hardware or whatever. And so those are the kind of things that you really want to think about. It's like, where's my value? Where's my risk? Where do I have resources available to deploy on those remediation efforts? And that then becomes a relatively long-tailed piece of work, depending on the size of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting. And as I mentioned at the top, that this, is one of the more challenging kind of issues in the data world, I think, because we have in the corporate world have been very successful about digitalizing everything that we do and creating more and more data for a variety of different purposes. And a lot of that, we're extracting more and more value from that data, especially in the age of AI. That said, we've done a very poor job around figuring out how to keep or delete that information. And in some cases, as you're pointing out, right, the ROI on the deletion portion may not be high. And as a result, there could be a business decision just to continue to retain this information indefinitely. So where these laws are pushing, and frankly, where as organizations are looking to manage information risk from a number of different perspectives, they are, I think, forced to change or think about data composition and data governance differently than they ever have before. But I think the often reaction is like, yes, we know, Scott, that is important for us to do, but it feels like it's such a large and daunting project and effort that it's somehow some side difficult to, one, gather the resources to be able to do it, and then two, to mandate or pull in the right type of kind of stakeholders to push it forward, and then three, to know where to begin. So interested in your perspective as clients are approaching this set of challenges and problems, any practice points that you have identified about how they can start to get their minds around this overall effort and the effort that will be needed, or the journey that will be needed going forward.
Yeah. So one of the key things to think about is strategic support, meaning, do you have leadership support? Some of this is going to be grassroots, but for this to really take off and be successful, you've got to have leadership that is supporting it, whether that's from the general counsel, the chief security officer, the chief privacy officer, the chief data officer, or grouping of all those folks. That is going to be a really big driver. The other thing is, you mentioned AI. There is going to be a competition that you have to be prepared for with the folks in data and analytics, because there's going to be a desire to keep all kinds of data because there's a potential for that data to be valuable and useful. And so the conversation there is to really understand where are they actually deriving value that are providing positive business outcomes, and where are they maintaining data that may not have shown any value and is likely not to in the future. And there's a real conversation that has to be had there. But understanding that The value, especially for folks that have a lot of customer data, which would be a lot of retail organizations that have, whether they have apps or their loyalty programs or whatever that provide rewards and they're tracking people's locations and whatever else, that stuff becomes very, very risky. And while it has value to understand your customers' tendencies and their preferences and those sort of things, there's a point where what people were doing 20 years ago is nowhere near what people are doing today. And so keeping it for that long may not have the value. And then there's a need to really look at that network internally of folks that understand the data and how they can help you, and pushing that forward as more of the grassroots approach. So then you get the top down and the bottom up. But without the top down, that's going to be one of your biggest struggles. And so think about who your friendlies are that can help support building the program or pushing it forward if you already have started.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned one thing I want to pick up on, Matt, around that conversation that needs to be had with the data analytics folks and the folks who are looking to spearhead these efforts. Because I agree that especially in the age of AI, there is an emphasis on maybe perhaps retaining more information to be able to use for training models and to be able to do on the product side. That said, I think if you're thinking about the type of effort that you're going through holistically, there is an opportunity to create real synergies that I think actually result
Sure.
in the benefit for those teams, including in the age of AI. Things like, for example, most organizations, or many organizations, I should say, don't have a full handle on the data that they have internally that could be used to be training those types of models. This effort kind of brings light to those maybe hidden data repositories. This effort, goes into the position of trying to define what rights you have to the data that you have collected. As we know, the physical possession of data doesn't mean the ability of using it for whatever purpose you have. You have a defined set of rights. And so to do this type of governance process actually facilitates the ability of knowing what data I can train off of, what data I can't. And then third, I would point out is that there is opportunities to bake in a strategy around data anonymization and de-identification into this process, which would allow for the ability of taking data that is useful for AI and perhaps removing elements that are going to create regulatory burdens or legal and contractual kind of issues, and turning those into ways that you can actually then facilitate your training of AI, which frankly is going to be the new norm for AI developers as customers ask, how did you train? How did you develop this? Did you have the rights to train it? Did you violate privacy rights when you trained it? And regulators essentially following the same question. So to me, the process that you're laying out, kind of while we're focusing on minimization and kind of some of those core aspects, has a much broader set of benefits in terms of how you can leverage this not to just defend against risk, but actually to create value.
For sure. And let's think about the actual process and the operation that happened for data analytics. There's an old cliche about junk in, junk out. If they have bad data, they're going to get bad outcomes. And so by getting rid of data that is either not relevant or is not useful, you can build a partnership there. I think being able to do the data mapping and the information asset risk ranking helps data analytics know where they can point their models and their training to get better outcomes. And so it really does become a partnership so that the analytics that's being done is more valuable and useful to the organization, and not just more of a scattershot approach where you just grab whatever data you can find and start trying to train. And so what it really is, and this is another way people have termed it, is data hygiene. Like you're getting a clean set of data for those folks in analytics so that their work is much more valuable to the organization and becomes a competitive advantage. Otherwise, you're really asking a lot of those analytics folks to find that valuable data through all of the junk. And if you can clean up the junk for them and understand and have a real conversation back and forth, it becomes a true partnership. And so you want those data analytics people sitting at the table, you want their input, you want to know where they're finding value, and then you can provide them the context of where the regulations lie and the guardrails of what they can stay in. And the anonymization is a bit of a compromise, right? We can't keep this data anymore because it's got too much unique specific privacy information about person, address, whatever. But to your point, we can do anonymization, and there's all kinds of different ways to do that allow you to have that training model for the AI and later on the analytics.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And maybe to underscore a point you made earlier, to build out that comprehensive strategy really requires a multidisciplinary, stakeholder effort to drive that forward, where you have compliance, legal, IT, information security, product, data analytics, so on, all kind of working together to understand where is the new data strategy for the organization, both on the risk management and on the value creation side of the house.
Yeah, and that is really driving toward a best practice around having a committee or a council, or whatever you want to call it, of those core data centric and compliance functions that then also bring in the business as needed to drive the change at the organization. And it's hugely valuable to have those different perspectives, because you're never going to have enough resources to cover all of the things that everybody wants. And so having those perspectives allow you to make the right decision for the organization that are going to drive valuable outcomes. And it's a little bit like talking about the journey earlier. A friend of mine in the space, and I've talked about this a number of times, that it is not doing this effort as a one-off to get skinny for your high school reunion. It is getting healthy for life, making changes to how you eat, the exercise, the sleep, right? To use that analogy, that's what we're doing with this data minimization effort, and all the different structure around it is really doing healthy living for the organization. And the data is just that, the redundant, obsolete, trivial data that's out there is really just that extra weight around the middle that we carry. And if we can get rid of that, we can get healthy as an organization.
That sounds like a good life lesson, probably for many of us across our lives, whether that corporate journey or our personal journey. But Matt, I really appreciate the insights that you were able to share in today's conversation. I learned a lot, and I look forward to opportunities for us to continue to collaborate.
For sure. Looking forward to it.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.